بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. مرحبا بكم في الجلسة الثانية.
Compassionate, thank you for being with us and welcome to the second session of the third day of the Gulf Studies Forum. This seventh session of the forum deals with two main themes. The first being the Iranian Arab Gulf countries relations. The second, the sovereign wealth fund. There was, on the first day, there was a lecture by Professor Luciani. Yesterday, we had the same themes. A number of panelists spoke about the different experiences and the policies of sovereign funds in the Gulf countries. Today, we continue. We have a number of panelists who will present important issues regarding the question of governance of sovereign wealth funds. I welcome the panelists and the participants and the attendees, and I would like to thank the organizers, the Arab Center for Research and Policy Study, for this wonderful organization, and all the team who are working relentlessly to run things smoothly. We have with us in this session Professor Faisal Monawer from Kuwait, Dr. Julien Maire, Dr. Adnan Mazarei, and Dr. Edwin Truman, and Dr. Tamara Schulz. We have some administrative announcement. First of all, please make sure you mute your mics when you're not taking part in the discussion, and please send your interventions and questions through the Q&A feature or raise hand. Use the raise hand feature for taking part in the discussion in this session. The most important instructions we have that we must respect the time limit. Each panelist is given 15 to 20 minutes maximum, and we will leave 30 minutes at the end to respond to the questions. We will start now with our first speaker, Professor Faisal Hamad Al-Munawar, he is an advisor to the Arab Institute for Planning Kuwait and head of research center and at the same institute. Formerly, he was a senior advisor to the Arab Council for Planning. He has many articles to his name, and the latest of which are two about the risks, and which was published in January 2020 in the Development Journal. The second one was about the challenges of development in the state of Kuwait, which was published by the relative journal of the Alexandria University. Professor Faisal will be speaking on the governance of sovereign wealth funds in the GCC countries, a proposed model. Professor Faisal, you have 15 minutes, please. Can you please remove? Thank you, Chair, for this introduction. I will speak of a proposed model for the governance of sovereign wealth funds in the GCC countries. Through my following up and research, there has been a problem that Gulf countries in particular and Arab countries suffer from relating to issues to do with transparency and governance. These problems emanate from the fact that political systems in this area do not believe in popular participation, democracy, or accountability. All of this has reflected, and specifically not accepting democratic principles has impacted the governance aspects of welfare, sovereign wealth funds, and we will see many bad issues in this regard. Most Arab countries are rated below the middle ranks, or even below that, except maybe for Qatar. And if we have the governance indexes, we see the indicators pertaining to accountability, for example, we find it very low. Naturally, this will impact on the performance of these funds, the sovereign wealth funds, and these are very large funds, and this large size of these funds has raised fears regarding things to do with investment, and also on the political interest also, because these funds, especially in the GCC countries, they have many weaknesses when it comes to governance and accountability and transparency. In the state of Kuwait, we have what we call the parliament, which is called Majlis al-Ummah, the Council of the Nation, in Arabic. And despite this being in existence from the beginning of the 60s, we still have a problem, and that is the sovereign wealth funds. They are not, the figures are not announced or published. This issue is discussed once a year before the parliament in a secret closed session, when what they call the general situation of the finances of the state are discussed in general. Maybe through that there will be mention of the sovereign wealth fund, and the parliamentarians, legislators, who have no detailed accounts of the performance of these funds. How do they work? What is their capital? How do they deal and mend the defects, problems? How they assess their work? Unfortunately, no information is available, and unfortunately, the political forces and the parliamentarian forces do not seem to be wanting to pass legislation to enforce the accountability and transparency, although it's estimated that the Kuwait fund is around $600 billion, which makes a profit of around $40 billion a year, yet it's surrounded with ambiguity, and there are no information being given about it. Also, when we talk about the most important sovereign funds in the GCC, like the Investment Commission, which was started in Kuwait in 1953, and it's considered the first sovereign fund in the world that was established when we have holding companies in Saudi have also assets more than 50. There is also Mubadala for development around $66 billion, and Qatar Investment Fund now was established in 2005. All these funds were established to invest the surplus by these funds to be invested. And I'll use the PowerPoint now. As we said, these funds have huge problems because they suffer from ambiguity and lack of clarity, and do not enjoy transparency, not at high level at least. The problem is, for example, regular reports about their aims behind the investment and what goes on. The lack of that has led to fear in Western countries, especially the industrialized ones, who provide the opportunity for investment, because these countries do not know what are the objectives behind these funds and what are their political ambitions, and there are fears about money laundering also. For this reason, these sovereign funds in the Gulf countries now going towards the emerging markets, because the governance there is not as it's in the other Western countries. Also, another important the governance aspect and the transparency aspect and supervision of them. In 2008, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, with 26 member countries who have sovereign funds, declared the Santiago in Chile principles and the so-called, I'll only mention three out of the rest. First of all, they urged the countries, relative countries, to have a legal or legislative framework to which these sovereign funds are based in a sound manner, and to determine its structures and aims, etc. And also the aims should be clear, and there should be declarations and a large number of coordination between the entities charged with managing these funds. And these principles made the group called Geoeconomica to prepare a study. This is located in Geneva, to establish these 24 principles, and it was discovered that in the GCC countries there was ambiguity and lack of transparency in these funds. Out of 31 sovereign funds, according to the research by this entity, that 9 were compliant and 9 were compliant generally, 8 partially compliant to these standards and principles. And what we can say that China, Kuwait, Abu Dhabi, Singapore, these countries have 4 major or 5 major funds. They were classified as partially compliant with these principles or standards. The Qatari fund was said was lacking compliance, and 4 other funds with no ability to be classified. The company could not classify them. The Norwegian fund was the best so far as transparency and governance is concerned, but this was based on collaboration between the central bank, which practices supervision, and the Ministry of Finance, which owns the fund, and the Parliament, which provides very stringent supervision, and also the international reports. When you visit the official page for Norway, you find a figure which gives you the assets of the fund, and it changes all the time. This is part and parcel of their transparency policy. There is another indicator, and Professor Truman is with us, and who was one of the experts who formulated these indicators using 4 standards, maybe, or principles. He will allude to them later on, but I can mention them quickly. The first was the structuring and transparency of finances, the returns, and the second indicator pertains to governance, the role of governance in setting the policies, the role of the management, and also the investments. And then there is a third one about transparency and accountability, and also the behavior in the markets where investments are made. There are 5 other questions, 14 questions for the transparency and accountability, and 6 for the behavior, standards of behavior. We found that the Gulf, the to be at the middle level is 15.1 point. This will place you above the middle ranking. If you below that, then your performance is bad. According to this indicator, the Kuwaiti Investment Fund had 15.75, which is in the middle. Behavior is nil because there is no, many countries have scored 0. Transparency and accountability, the scoring is very low. The Norwegian one has got 14, the others between 5.75 and below, and this requires revisiting. The Norwegian fund has reached 30.5 points, which is a high score according to these indicators. We have uh, we have another indicator, the Madwell, which every 4 months assesses the situation with these funds through 10 indicators or standards, criterion, like the availability of information on the aims and also regular reports, independent annual reports on the performance, information on the branches, and also the different managing authorities having an electronic website, and the rest. These 10 points every 3 months are assessed, and these are 2020 data, not 2019. Like, for example, the EIA Mubadala with 10 points, Bahrain Mumtalakat 10, Saudi Arabia, the General Investment Fund 7, UAE, the Abu Dhabi Investment Fund, etc., until we reach 3 at the bottom. These indicators and the criterion and standards of governance and the lack of transparency in the GCC, the sound quality is not so good. We try. The first point in this proposal, I call for we how they deal with things, what are the accountability standards, procedures. These are not there, and the government seems to be absent from all of this, like the size of assets, for example. If the transparency is not there and supervision is not there, how can we monitor these things? of course, the availability of information about these funds. These are very important issues. There must be regular reports and information on performance. The problem with researchers today, when we want to discuss anything to do with these sovereign funds, there is a terrible lack of information. And this has been a source of controversy and debate amongst academicians and researchers. The other aspect we should consolidate the frameworks of integrity in the work of these funds. Unfortunately, these are not available not only when it comes to sovereign fund, but in the entire system, whether the financial or the political. Maybe a little bit of it is there, but when we're talking about governance at this level, this is not available. Also, how to guarantee the effectiveness and the performance of these sovereign funds, there should be strategies taking us to that level. And also there should be clarity about the aims and the work of these funds, and also respect of the legal framework, and also the procedures, the working procedures. Also, there should be clarity in the aims and of the fields of activity for these cells, and also they should be utilized for the purposes of development in their countries. If we have entities who are tasked with supervising and evaluating this, then the whole performance will be better. I'll try in the next few weeks maybe to provide more information, a bit more clarity, in the hope that officials in these countries will take into account these aspects in managing these funds. I thank you, Dr. Ohood at Bulushi, for allowing me the opportunity, and I thank the forum, and I'm ready to answer your questions.
باقي دقيقة بس ما شاء الله. بننتقل إن شاء الله لل.
Thank you very much, Doctor. You've just ended on time, or a minute before the end of the time. We have 3 speakers now. The session is entitled Sovereign Wealth Funds and Investment Policies of the GCC States. Dr. Julien, Maire, Adnan, Mazarei, and Edwin, Truman will be talking about the sovereign wealth funds of the GCC countries, governance and prospects. We'll be having 3 parts of this intervention, 7 minutes each. So every researcher will have a PowerPoint presentation that stretches over 7 minutes under the title of the Sovereign Wealth Funds of the GCC countries, Governance and Prospects. Dr. Julien will start. He'll be speaking obviously in English, and those who need Arabic translation, you can press on the button that says Spanish.
وسبحان الله بتطلع له اللغة العربية. دكتور جوليان مير هو محلل بحوث في معهد بيترسون للاقتصاد.
Dr. Julien works at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and his research deals with macroeconomics, and he used to be an advisor for the World Bank in the past. Dr. Julien, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting us to present our paper, The Sovereign Wealth Funds of the GCC Region, Governance and Prospects. So this is the outline of today's presentation. First, I will introduce our paper. then highlight the slowing growth of sovereign wealth funds, and present briefly the results of the 2019 scoreboard on transparency and accountability. Then, Ted Truman will present in more detail the scoreboard results for the GCC sovereign wealth funds. And finally, Adnan Mazarei will present the economic outlook for the GCC sovereign wealth funds and the governance challenges. So first, sovereign wealth funds attracted attention in the 2000s. There were multiple concerns about them due to their rapid growth coupled with potential economic, financial, and political impacts outside their home country. For this reason, Edwin Truman developed a scoreboard to assess the transparency and accountability of the principal sovereign wealth funds in the world. Today, we present the results of the 5th edition, the 2019 Sovereign Wealth Fund Scoreboard. It appears that the score of the
Julien,
53 sovereign wealth funds previously scored have improved on average. Yeah.
Yes, we cannot hear you. Your voice is very low. Can you please come closer to the microphone?
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Is it better?
Yes, it's better.
Okay. Sorry about that. And then the second result of this edition is that the sovereign wealth funds of the GCC tend to score lower than other groups of funds. The GCC members and their funds are facing daunting challenges in adjusting to a world less reliant on hydrocarbon revenues. In recent years, risks have increased due to rising environmental concerns, also because GCC countries are more vulnerable to potential fiscal difficulties, and this is compounded by the recent sharp decline in oil revenues. We believe that the assets of the sovereign wealth funds funded from oil and gas are likely to decline, or at least slow their rate of increase in the coming years. And for us, it's really important to maintain efforts to improve the governance and the accountability of sovereign wealth funds. So it's clear that there is a slowing growth of sovereign wealth funds in terms of their asset accumulation. This table shows the pace of the expansion of the assets of the 31 funds first reviewed on the 2000 scoreboard.
Do you want to put up your PowerPoint?
Oh, you cannot see my PowerPoint?
No, I don't think you ever put it up.
Okay. Oh, yeah, okay. So, okay, can you see now? Okay, so great. So, okay. According to this table showing the pace of the expansion of the assets funds first reviewed on the 2007 scoreboard and that continue to be reviewed afterward, it's clear that there is a slowing growth of the sovereign wealth fund. Growth was rapid in the first two periods. So for instance, if we look at the 31 funds, the annual growth rate in terms of asset accumulation was equal to 4.1% between 2008 and 2010. Between 2010 and 2013, this annual growth rate was equal in average to 11.5%. But then the growth rate generally slowed during the third period, especially for the non-GCC oil and gas funds. Between 2013 and 2016, the annual growth rate was equal to only 1.4% in comparison to 13.6% during the previous period. And finally, growth slowed more substantially over the past 4 years as oil and gas price decline. If we look at the funds of the GCC, oil and gas funds, the annual growth rate of their assets was equal to 1% between 2016 and 2020.
Dr. Julien,
Yes.
you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay, I'm finishing. This is my last slide. And so today we present the new scoreboard of sovereign wealth funds on transparency and accountability. In this new edition, 64 funds are covered in comparison to 60 funds covered in the 2015 scoreboard. 11 funds have been added to this new scoreboard, but 7 funds from the 2015 scoreboard are not included. So if we look at the average of the 53 funds, in 2015, their score was equal in average to 54. And in 2019, the average score in terms of transparency and accountability was equal to 68. So there is a clear improvement in transparency and accountability in these two periods. Then if we look at the 11 new funds, they have a lower score than the other funds. They score only in average to 59. And overall, the 60 funds covered in the new scoreboard have an average score of 66. So now Edwin Truman will talk more in details about the scores for the GCC funds.
Thank you. Let me put up my share screen.
I didn't have the time to introduce you. If you give me just a few seconds to introduce you, Dr. Dr. Edwin Truman, who was
Dr. Edward Truman is a non-resident senior fellow and senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics since 2001. Also served as Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury for International Affairs between 1998 and 2001, and a counselor to the Secretary in 2009, and Director of the Division of International Finance at the Fed since 1977 up to 1998. Dr. Truman, the floor is yours. And please, could you raise your voice and be closer to the microphone? Thank you.
Okay. I'll do the best. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm sure you interrupt me if you can't. So it's a pleasure to participate with my Peterson Institute colleagues in this conference. My only regret is that we can't be there in Doha, which I was looking forward to. I do thank the organizers for the opportunity to present the 5th Sovereign Wealth Fund scoreboard, as Julien just introduced it, and I will report on our results for the GCC funds. Let me get this right. So this slide shows the progression of scores for the GCC Sovereign Wealth Funds. We score them on a 33-element scoreboard, and then we adjust that to a scale of 0 to 100. So the 4 GCC funds at the top of the table that were among the 31 funds that were have been scored 5 times. And then there are 10 funds were included in the 5th scoreboard, which Julien just said that covered 74 funds. So the range of scores for the GCC funds is quite wide on each scoreboard, 24 to 77 on this scoreboard, as well as the overall scoreboard where the range is 11 to 100. I think Dr. Faisal presented the results from the previous scoreboard. This is the first time any fund has scored 100. I have to toughen up the scoreboard. So, I'm sorry, I moved too fast. Funds generally increased their scores on successive scoreboards. Adia and Mubadala and the investment company Dubai stand out for their increases. The Kuwait Investment Authority has consistently scored above the GCC and the overall average. I do have a bit of a puzzle as why you have a range of scores for the UAE funds, 53 percentage points. In the case of the United States, where there are also a bunch of subnational funds, there's also a range, but it's not quite as wide. It's only 24 points. So now I could go to the third slide. This slide presents the scores of the 64 funds organized by their source. Funds that derive their financing from natural resources, underground wealth, account for more than half of the sovereign wealth fund assets and almost 2/3 of the funds. The shares of this group were even larger in 2007, as I think we all know. And you see on average that the GCC, place here, score lower than the average for other oil and gas funds, and score lower than the average for funds that derive their financial resources from other sources. Now, as explained by Dr. Faisal just previously, the scoreboard's 33 elements are arranged in 4 subcategories. This slide presents the results for the GCC funds and other funds in the first subcategory, which I call structure, and emphasizes the legal and organization structure of the fund. GCC funds on average do less well in this category than the other funds. The differences are most pronounced with respect to the statement of the legal framework for the fund, having a clear source of the funds, and even though the source of the funds is obvious, oil, and how the earnings of the fund will be used. The second section of the scoreboard focuses on governance, what I call governance elements. I should argue that I should explain that these divisions are somewhat arbitrary. On average, the GCC funds do feel almost as well as the other funds. Notable, however, in my view, is the relatively high score on the definition of the role of managers, 90 versus 75 for the other funds, compared with the relatively low score on the extent to which decisions are actually made by those managers, 35 versus 50. So that suggests that although the manager's role is very well defined, the managers actually don't control very much, influence very much. So this is the third part of the scoreboard, which focuses on transparency elements, which was much discussed yesterday as well as today, and as the key, as I think it's been made clear by others, to accountability questions. Again, the GCC funds on average fall short of the other funds. As I think was just mentioned, 5 GCC funds do not report their size. And only one other fund among the 64 does not report its size. So this is a particular area where the sensitivity of reporting the size of the fund is impacted. Only 6 publish annual reports, or say they publish annual reports, and one that says so, we couldn't find the report. And only 4 publish their audits, which is well below the average for the other funds. The last category of the scoreboard is how funds operate or behave. It's sort of a catch-all category. Actually, few sovereign wealth funds score highly in this subcategory, except with respect to the articulation of their risk management policies. The GCC funds on average are no exception, including the clear statement of the risk management policies. I think I'd like to generalize a little bit and say the GCC funds are not all the same, right? And there are important differences among the funds. I do not know enough about the countries as other people on this conference do to know why these differences are there. But I think it is important to spell these things out and to pursue improvements. Though I want to emphasize again that on average over time, the funds have improved. I think I skipped over one point, which was the ADIA. Actually, first score, I'm going to 31 second or 5 seconds. ADIA is actually, which I showed earlier, it actually responded to the first scoreboard by dramatically increasing its score on the second scoreboard. So public opinion seems to have some influence on what the management of the funds do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Truman. We'll move now to the third part by Dr. Adnan Mazarei. دكتور عدنان هو زميل بحث غير مقيم في معهد بيترسون الاقتصاد الدولي. شغل منصب نائب مدير في صندوق النقد الدولي حيث عمل على
He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Previously worked as deputy director at the International Monetary Fund, where he worked on resolving various financial crises in emerging markets, including in 1998 Russian financial crisis. In addition to that, he contributed to the IMF's policy work on international financial architecture and sovereign debt issues. Dr. Adnan, the floor is yours. You've got 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be with you.
Sure.
What I would like to do is to discuss the economic outlook very quickly, and then discuss some of the implications of this changing outlook for some of the governance and the governments of the sovereign wealth funds. Early in 2020, my former colleagues at the IMF prepared a study of fiscal sustainability in the GCC countries. The main results were demand for oil was likely to peak in 2 decades, especially because of the mounting concerns about environmental issues. This trend, together with the rising supply of shale oil, created a substantial downward pressure on oil prices, and therefore creating, in the years ahead, serious challenges to the sustainability of the GCC countries' fiscal positions. With the spread of the pandemic, the economic and the financial prospects for those countries became far worse. And the outlook painted even that unfavorable IMF report even became more difficult. The GCC countries are now projected by the IMF to lose 6% of their output this year, before going up a little bit next year. The debts or fiscal deficits are averaging now about 9% of GDP. The debt of these countries, which has been rising over time, had declined, but are now expected to rise again. Under these circumstances of shrinking fiscal means and heightened social stress on the account of the pandemic, I think the governance of the sovereign wealth funds would likely to become more central in economic policy making and in social political debates in these countries. Why? One issue is that there will be more questions about the financial performance of sovereign wealth funds. Of course, they're contributing more to the defense of their country's economies. Their assets could lose considerable value due to global asset prices. And in these days of rapid change and high uncertainty, it is more difficult to have a suitable benchmark and investment horizon for the sovereign wealth funds. And sovereign wealth fund performance would likely become more of a focus for their owners, managers, and the general public. The second issue is the relationship between the sovereign wealth funds and their budgets. Sovereign wealth funds are likely to come under pressure to contribute more to their national budgets. However, there will be questions about the size and the government's payments into and withdrawals from the sovereign wealth funds, and whether they are rule-based or ad hoc. A good example is Kuwait, where the government and the parliament have been at odds over withdrawals from the Kuwaiti Sovereign Wealth Fund. Another factor is explaining and justifying the current investment strategies of sovereign wealth funds. In the world we live in now, especially in a period of high uncertainty and social pressures, investment strategies will become more difficult to articulate and defend. And issues will arise regarding investments abroad by sovereign wealth funds that may be trying to take advantage of distressed international asset prices and diversify their income sources. In principle, this could be a useful thing to do, but there will be questions by the population and the various stakeholders about the merits of investing abroad. Overall, it is likely that the sovereign wealth funds will have to become more domestically oriented. At the same time, although oil prices are going down, investments by sovereign wealth funds abroad are likely to become more smaller and smaller over time. The world has changed dramatically in the last few years in terms of political postures and views toward populism and nationalism. And it is likely that there will be more questions coming up about the political motivations of sovereign wealth funds. And again, host countries could raise, as in the past, more questions about the sovereign wealth funds and their management. Against this background, it is of course likely that governance and accountability of sovereign wealth funds will become matters of greater public interest and concern both at home and abroad. And it indicates the results that my colleagues have presented indicates that there is considerable progress that needs to be made. There are major pockets of weak performance, and especially in part of our region where democratic institutions, accountability and transparency are a problem, it is likely these sovereign wealth funds will become more entangled in those domestic political debates. Thank you.
Thank you very much. شكرا كثيرا دكتور عدنان. And thank you for sticking
Thank you, Dr. Adnan, and thank you for abiding by the time.
المشكلة لما الواحد يعني يحول من عربي لإنجليزي فنرجع للغة العربية اللي هي اخترنا أن تكون هي لغة المنتدى بشكل.
All right, I will come back to speak Arabic now. I'm confused between speaking Arabic and English. I would like to thank you for your paper. I would like to thank you for shedding light on the factors that relate to the governance of the sovereign wealth funds and the betterment thereby of accountability, transparency, and governance in light of the economic situation that we are facing. The third paper will be presented by Tamara Kamhawi. She worked at Transparency International since 2006 up to 2010, and she worked for a number of institutions. She worked as an advisor for a number of UN bureaus, Save the Children, and other institutions. The paper is entitled GCC Sovereign Wealth Funds, a call for cultural governance. Please, could you put your mics on mute mode? And I would like to remind you to write down your questions at the Q&A feature in order to answer them at a later stage following this intervention. Dr. Tamara, the floor is yours.
I would like to thank the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for this opportunity, and thank my colleagues for their valuable information, and the moderator, Dr. Bulushi. I would like to focus today on an important aspect that is usually taken for granted, and that's the cultural governance and its relation to the sovereign wealth funds. I would like to first say that cultural governance is a wide-ranging term, and it could incorporate many aspects, such as cultural policy made by governments which impact cultures. It could also extend to cultural influence exerted by non-state actors, and to any policies which influence culture indirectly. In my opinion, we are addressing here two aspects: outside influence on sovereign wealth funds like civil society organization, media, the private sector, which refers to society, way of life, and relationships in human practices and institution. Over the past decade, we have noticed that the sovereign wealth funds have grown in power, becoming major players in the global economy, placing them in center of attention. We also noticed that the Gulf sovereign wealth funds also made significant shifts in their strategies, that in some cases they have actively contributed to local economies and industrial and digital developments, that's actively participating in the process of innovation and access to knowledge through strategic investments in research and education. This shows that there will be a voluntary cross-cultural transfer of values and fundamentals. This has been initially regulated by the International Monetary Fund, IMF working group through Santiago Principles, which my colleagues have talked about, and which aim to produce a voluntary code of conduct for sovereign wealth funds, and many Gulf sovereign wealth funds have actively participated. But it is far from certain that this effort is sufficient to acquire the necessary degree of legitimacy to shield global financial markets from crises due to either political intervention or lack of transparency, accountability, and corruption. Taking in their new role, Gulf sovereign wealth funds need to go a step further by making an active contribution to the development of norms and principles that will provide long-term stability, incorporating positive culture and national values, of course. The rise of sovereign wealth funds and the structural transformation of international financial markets have posed challenges to key principles and norms, including transparency and governance standards, which have long been important components of the international financial architecture. Gulf sovereign wealth funds need to play a key role in converting their code of conduct into a constructive institutional framework, covering both national and international standards, because a code of conduct that is only designed to help avoid controversy and to maintain business as usual, in my opinion, will be insufficient, as we have seen with the case of the Malaysian development Berhad scandal and other cases. I would like here to also refer back to Transparency International National Integrity System that has 11 pillars ranging from legislative, executive, judiciary, public sector law enforcement, electoral management body, ombudsman, supreme audit institutions, and anti-corruption body, political parties, and civil society and businesses, and is based on a holistic approach to preventing corruption, since it looks at the entire range of relevant institutions and also focuses on the relationships among them. Foremost, this system is based on the economic, cultural, and society foundation. Thus, the national integrity system presupposes that a lack of integrity in a single institution would lead to serious flaws in the entire integrity system. this model could be applied to sovereign wealth funds. I recommend, in my opinion, sovereign wealth funds should offer an in-depth evaluation of each pillar and at assessing how best they could benefit from this model and build strategic relations and linkages with sovereign wealth structures to create a sound governance system that would also enhance cultural policies. In my opinion, such a holistic system analysis is necessary to be able to appropriately diagnose corruption risks on the one hand and develop effective strategies to counter those political risks, especially with globalization and of the effect of domino that we see recently. I have visited most of the websites of the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, and most of them highlighted importance of code of conduct, transparency, and accountability, and mentioned values of integrity, respect, accountability, collaboration, leadership, and we have noticed that they have not really said how these aspects and values and code of conduct are being institutionalized and transferred within sovereign wealth funds work and to new local and international investors. Gulf sovereign wealth funds have the opportunity to present and enhance the practices of these code of conducts and values that are part of cultural governance, especially as their influence is growing. Earlier this year, many Gulf sovereign wealth funds took advantage of fluctuating prices in the global stock markets. In fact, many Gulf sovereign wealth funds took position at the start of the pandemic of not wasting a crisis from opportunities and took sizable stakes in blue chip stocks from finance, technology, and entertainment. This brought to service the question of whether the sovereign wealth funds' spending habits are as a result of public national interest of personal ones, as well as further debate on how much top-down influence there is in directing the investment process by directing these investments to companies to which senior authorities have personal stakes. One example I could refer to is the Saudi public decision to invest in the cruise line operator Carnival, which many doubt would have been the decision of the fund, which is generating the growing fund concern of lack of an independent investment committee and management.
Dr. Tamara?
Yeah?
I think your voice is fading a bit.
Okay, I'm getting closer.
Yes.
However, to really become once the largest wealth funds and other Gulf sovereign wealth funds need to start working on major readjustment and change of their strategies with a larger focus on local investments. The Saudi government wealth fund is now being ambitious in putting more investments in local projects and announced earlier this year of having a large-scale new plan involving several different projects in the local economy with the objectives of developing the local economy to create more job opportunities. And many are eagerly watching to see if their local sovereign wealth funds will perform during these challenging times. The challenge of rising to a global role, Gulf sovereign wealth funds are in the process of a profound transformation. The Gulf sovereign wealth funds will seek to spread their interest across developed and emerging economies, as well as to forge new partnerships in the emerging markets, such as East Asia, Africa, and Latin American. Therefore, should present the code of conducts and cultural values they would like to proceed with. Gulf sovereign wealth funds will need to build a corresponding knowledge base in order to succeed. The tremendous growth of sovereign wealth funds and the diversification of their portfolios and the sophistication will bring them into the center position in global financial markets. Even if they wanted to play the quiet role as investors, their newfound visibility would prevent them from doing so. Their increasingly diverse mandate and the sophistication of the investment strategies have exposed them to a global and ever more politicized audience. This exposure has or could add another layer of complexity to their overall investment strategies. Nevertheless, the diversification of Arab economies could have a positive impact on economic and social development in a region that the West perceives to be highly unstable. My recommendations in conclusions would include the following. Gulf sovereign wealth funds could undergo regular self-assessment, internal institutionalizations of the cultural and social values and code of conducts, build the qualifications of their staff and management through trainings, developing case studies, especially that most sovereign wealth funds are made of diverse and international staff, creating a highly collaborative work environment that embodies cultural values. Thirdly, Gulf sovereign wealth funds should take initiative to integrate their cultural and governance into everyday business and set an example for further developments and investments. Last but not least, not forgetting that transparency, access to information, and accountability are based on cultural values of integrity and respect. And this is what will build a kind of trust between the sovereign wealth fund and the population. Thank you very much for listening. And hope to get your questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tamara. شكرا جزيلا للأساتذة الباحثين على هذا
Thank you for all our panelists, and we open the floor now for questions. We have a number of questions on the Q&A. There are also questions from the social media. This session should finish at 6:45 Doha time, so that gives us about 27 minutes. I am bad in math. Please help me count. So each person should have 3 minutes. Each person can have 3 minutes then. After I finish reading the questions, there is one question directed to Professor Faisal. The rest of the questions are general for all the speakers or panelists. We start with a question which came through the social media. I read the questions as they are. If they are in Arabic, I read them in Arabic. If they are in English, I read them in English. A question from the social media. All interventions agree that all the sovereign funds in the Gulf are not compliant so far as the Santiago Principles are concerned. In your opinion, what is the explanation of these varying degrees of compliance, and what are the repercussions for not complying? This is a general question to all panelists. Another question: is there no system of governance for these funds? The questioner, Mr. Hussein, is asking, are there not any systems in the GCC for governance, that is, of these sovereign funds? The third question is,
and fuel the required change and reforms with relation to governance, accountability, and transparency of sovereign wealth funds to be directed to achieve a newly legal and institutional just governing system while holding the mission of serving both the governments and humans. From Professor Fuad. السؤال الرابع موجه ل
The question is directed to Professor Faisal. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. I think we answered most of these questions. The continued fluctuation, also in the varying degrees of adherence and compliance, so far as Santiago Principles, is a problem for all Arab countries and especially the Gulf countries when it comes to administration and government finance, etc. This is a general weakness, and this is indicated by almost all other international indicators so far as governance is concerned. The risk indicators, national risk factors, also indicators on doing business, the international transparency indicator. All of these show that in Gulf countries specifically and in Arab countries in general, there is a weakness in this regard. This is on top of the weakness in adhering to the standards of governance, transparency, and this is a reflection of a general situation or a general trend which is reflected in the funds, in the sovereign funds. The situation is more or less the same for all Arab countries. In the GCC, there is no legal framework, no laws on transparency. Even the ones which do exist are just there theoretically with no application. Also, in the GCC countries and the rest of the Arab countries, there are legal frameworks, there are legislations, there are institutes of supervisory institutes, but the curves keep going up. In Kuwait, we have 12 such entities which should play an advisor, a supervisory role, yet the problems are compounding: corruption, money laundering, etc., etc. All of this impacts the governance, the question of governance. So therefore, these entities which were put in place to play this supervisory role are meaningless now. They have no value. So far as the research is concerned, there have been far too many research papers, but unfortunately, if you want something to succeed, you have to have the political. David Aston says the values are embedded through the authority or something to this effect. How can accountability and transparency can be used to have a lasting and just governance system? All of this is linked to the political will. Unfortunately, there is no such political will despite the many integrity, supervisory, etc., regulating. These are just formalities, they're just form of a decoration. We should have them, but their effectiveness, in my opinion, is not up to standard, and the evidence to this that corruption, money laundering, embezzlement, etc., has become apparent in the GCC countries. And if I may add, if there is a real regulation and supervision and performance assessment of the sovereign fund, we will be amazed to find out what they suffer from by way of corruption. I'll give you one small example to finish it. In Kuwait, for the last 15 years, our sovereign fund is between 550 to 560 billion dollars in size, despite the fact that every year we take 10% of our oil revenues to finance this fund, and the days of the boom in oil prices, the government for 2, 3, 4 years continued to deduct 25% of the revenues to fund these funds, yet the size remains almost stagnant. So therefore, these funds are suffering from huge losses and very bad investment, and also when it comes to the giving out any information, this is surrounded by secrecy. What about popular supervisory roles? You know, the people of Kuwait is alive and really is engaged and interactive with the situation, because we had, in fact, we have a margin of freedom at some stage or some period. The Constitution still enshrines articles safeguarding these liberties and rights. But after the so-called Arab revolutions and Arab Spring, there have been now some sort of limits applied, limitations, and the people continue talking about these things and raise questions about them, because in fact, if you do not have the transparency, then don't blame people to say for saying what they say, because you as funds have placed yourselves in this. You are the rulers. You are acting on my behalf as people to run my affairs. So if you act on my behalf, you should really keep me informed of what goes on with my wealth, with my rights. Unfortunately, this methodology is not there, because the idea of the state is something that we suffer from. Despite what you're saying, Professor, in Dr. Julien and the rest of his team's paper, it was noted that there was an improvement in the average indicators for GCC funds. So there is an improvement according to the figures which were shared by the group of researchers on the governance. Now we thank you very much, Professor Faisal. We go to Dr. Julien.
Or comment on them?
And maybe given the time remaining, I will let my colleagues Edwin and Adnan give their own answers, if they agree.
Thank you. Dr. Truman?
Yes, thank you. So let me make 2 points and then turn it over to Adnan. I prefer to view the world as the glass as having been being half full rather than half empty in terms of all this. All the sovereign wealth funds in general and the sovereign wealth funds of the Gulf region are different, right? And they're different because they have different cultures and backgrounds and so forth and so on. And in fact, a number of the funds in the GCC funds do quite well based upon my scoreboard. And one way to proceed on this is to say, well, why does Fund X do well? And why does Fund Y do less well? Can they learn from each other? And I think in general, they have learned from each other. As I said, in the case of, and sometimes from outside pressures, in the case, as I said earlier, in the case of the ADIA, their at least formal behavior changed dramatically in response to the original scoreboard that we put up. I will make one other comment, it was a reference to the Santiago Principles. Generally, the scores on these funds on the Santiago Principles, which you can map into the 13 elements of the 33 elements of the scoreboard, is about the same. They're very highly correlated, the scores. So that in some sense, if they do well on our scoreboard, they do well on the Santiago Principles. If they do weekly on one, they less well. And I'll let Adnan, who knows more about the region than I do, now talk.
Actually, there are two other questions for you, Dr. Truman and Dr. Adnan. I'll read them in Arabic. سؤال الدكتور ترومان دكتور عدنان ما هي قدرة
What is the ability of the World Bank and other international organizations concerned with transparency to regulate or act as a supervisory capacity on these funds? Secondly, in the absence of real strategic choices of implementing the Santiago Principles or the weakness in compliance, what possible impact will this have on future diversification? Dr. Truman.
Let me refer. I'm going to try the second question, and Adnan, who spent more time with the bank and the fund than the first part. I would like to think that these principles and adhering to these principles might become in time could become a screen for countries that want to invest abroad. As Adnan has mentioned, some of these investments have been controversial. That's partly why we got the Santiago Principles to begin with. And one would hope that the various investment regimes might take account of the performance of funds on these various bases when they review various investment activities. But I'll let Adnan comment himself.
Sure. Thank you very much. Look, on the broader question of the governance of these funds, the governance transparency of these funds cannot be too different from the governance structure and the accountability frameworks of their countries. Okay. There is perhaps the better example in some Nordic countries, okay, the Norwegian fund, and some of the not so great ones in our good region. So this problem is not just limited to the GCC. And there is increasingly in some of the countries tension between various stakeholders. Let me give you an example for my own country, Iran. The role of the Sovereign Wealth Fund in the budget, especially in light of sanctions, has become much more pronounced. Okay. In some ways, the use of the resources has become more arbitrary. The most recent example of that arbitrary use is the decision by the government to spend 1% of the entire assets of the fund to prop up equity prices. Okay, on the bad side. This is on the bad side. On the other side, there is some tension in the parliament over these things in Iran. And there are reports prepared by the parliament about how the government uses the fund so arbitrarily and non-transparently. Okay, but this issue is a sign of the tensions within each country if it does progress toward more democratic institutions, and that's not necessarily given. On the IFIs, and Ted was also working on the same front at the same time that we put together the Santiago Principles. The Santiago Principles came in good part because of the pressures from host countries. Okay. There was also some sense among some of the sovereign wealth funds that they wanted to be transparent with some of the things they did, especially to protect themselves vis-a-vis other stakeholders within those countries. But essentially, the consensus that was eventually formed was that the Santiago Principles were supposed to be a set of best practices. It is not a code of conduct. It is not something that the IFI, international financial institutions, can go out and enforce. And it was something, it was a set of principles that was supposed to be enforced by each sovereign wealth fund and by the group of sovereign wealth funds collectively, okay? And the sovereign wealth funds did not want one of the IFIs to be enforcing this. And I don't think this is going to change very much.
Thank you, Dr. Adnan. There is one more question. Perhaps Dr. Tamara would like to answer. I read it in Arabic. هل يوجد نظام
Is there a system to measure the risks faced by the sovereign funds in the Gulf to assess for risk assessment and get guaranteed investment, and or should we just focus on transparency and governance?
I mean, I'm more concerned about the cultural, not in the aspect of something that can really make sure if investments are profitable or not. This is kind of difficult, but I think if you have the right code of conduct and the right regulations and the right standards of Santiago Principles and transparency and accountability, then this will prevent any risks of investments in the future. And this is why I concentrated mostly on two aspects: the inside aspects of the sovereign wealth funds in regard to values, and the outside aspects of having regulations and code of conduct and standards that the sovereign wealth funds should contribute, especially now that their investments are more sophisticated, whether we're referring to domestic investments or actually in other parts of the world like Latin America or the Asia continent.
Okay, would you like to add anything with regard to the other questions? The question, yeah. The first question. The first question that was asked about the different levels of adherence to the Santiago Principles. And
yes, there's definitely different levels, and even within the Gulf states, there are differences. The standards are different, and that's why we cannot really say each one of the Gulf states countries should find its own appropriate standards so that they can move forward. But definitely with the increase of influence that they're going to have and the multinationalities that are working in these sovereign wealth funds and the information and the know-how that they're going to, that they will transfer to other countries, they have to start from within first to put their mechanism and their standards so that they keep developing these standards and not always wait from pressure from outside to build these standards.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tamara. Thank you. I would like لازم أحول للعربي الحين. It's always difficult to switch between two languages, for me at least. أشكر الجميع.
I thank you all for being with us and taking part. We thank the panelists for their valuable papers. We thank the organizers for this beautiful organization of this event. I'd also like to remind you we have more sessions tomorrow and day after tomorrow. You have to register, and this can be done through the official site of the Arab Center. And have a nice evening. وطبتم.
Thank you very much.